All right, so we're back and ready to dive deep today. And this time, we're looking at something that's been making waves. President Trump's surprise tariff announcement. We've got tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. And yeah, to say the markets are a little on edge is putting it mildly, but here's where it gets really interesting. This seemingly political move could actually end up impacting everything from how much you pay for a car to, get this, what the Federal Reserve decides to do next. I've got our expert here with me to help us break it all down. So, what was the immediate market reaction when this news hit?
Well, the markets definitely didn't like it. We saw a pretty immediate drop across all the major U.S. stock indices. The S&P 500, that went down by 0.5%. The NASDAQ deeped 0.4%. And the Dow Jones, that took the biggest hit, down 0.8% that day.
Okay, so yeah, those are pretty significant drops, especially when you think about how the markets have been trending upwards recently. What's behind this sudden shift to negative territory?
I think a lot of it boils down to investor fear, honestly. There's a lot of worry that these tariffs could really throw a wrench in the economy, especially when it comes to, what consumers pay for things and how smoothly supply chains run.
So basically, are we talking about things costing more in the grocery store and longer wait times to get the products we need?
Exactly. Look at the auto industry, for example. The big U.S. automakers, they rely on parts from Canada and Mexico. If these tariffs make those parts more expensive, well, it's going to ripple out, right? Car prices could go up, or it could even slow down production. We could see higher price tags on new cars, or maybe even delays in getting them.
So that could spell trouble for companies like General Motors and Ford, who are already facing stiff competition in the global car market, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just cars either. Any industry that depends on imports from these countries, they could all feel the squeeze.
So it's a global thing, right? How are international markets reacting?
It's kind of a mixed bag right now globally. It's interesting, though. Asian markets have been pretty resilient, maybe taking a wait-and-see kind of approach. But overall, yeah, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty swirling around.
It sounds like even if some investors are hoping for a quick fix, this is having a ripple effect on a global scale. This isn't just a U.S. problem, it's a global one.
Exactly right. And that brings us to another big economic concept we need to think about, inflation.
Right, inflation. Can you explain how tariffs play into that?
Sure. So basically, tariffs increase the cost of imported goods. And then businesses often have to raise prices to cover those higher costs. When you see prices going up across the board, that's when you get inflation. And this is where the Federal Reserve steps in. They play a really crucial role here.
So, given that the Fed's main job is to keep inflation under control, how might they react to all of this?
Yeah.
And what might that mean for the rest of us?
Well, they've got a few tools in their belt, and interest rates are a big one. We've already seen long-term Treasury yields going up, and that suggests investors are betting on the Fed raising interest rates to try and combat inflation.
But increasing interest rates, that can also have a negative effect on the economy, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Raising interest rates can help to slow down inflation, but it can also make it harder for businesses to borrow money and invest, which can slow down economic growth.
So it seems like the Fed is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They need to deal with potential price increases from these tariffs, but also be careful about stalling the economy in the process.
You got it. That's exactly what makes this whole thing so tricky. There's no easy solution. It's all about finding the right balance.
And this whole situation started with this decision to put these tariffs in place. Weren't they supposed to help American jobs and industries? Is there a chance this could backfire and actually hurt the people it's trying to help?
That's the big question, isn't it? The idea behind tariffs is to make those imported goods more expensive, encouraging people to buy American-made stuff instead. The hope is that this will help to boost domestic production and create more jobs. It's like an America-first economic strategy.
But it sounds like you're saying it's not that straightforward in reality.
Yeah, unfortunately, things rarely work out so perfectly. Tariffs can sometimes lead to retaliation from other countries, which ends up hurting American businesses that rely on exports. It could spark a trade war, and historically, those rarely have any winners.
And then on top of that, we have the potential for inflation and maybe the Fed raising interest rates. It sounds like we're looking at a domino effect that could impact almost every corner of the economy.
You're absolutely right. It's all connected. And one policy change can trigger a chain reaction with both good and bad consequences.
So for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around this, what are the key things they should keep in mind?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay informed and really think about what the potential impacts could be. Keep an eye on prices, especially for things you buy that are imported from Canada, Mexico, and China. And if you're thinking about making a big purchase that needs financing, like a house or a car, be aware that interest rates could be going up in the near future.
That's solid advice. We'll be right back after a quick break to dig into this even further. Okay, so we're back, and I'm thinking we should take a closer look at what these tariffs could mean in the long run. One of the articles you sent mentioned the steel industry. What's going on there?
Yeah, steel's an interesting one. It was one of the sectors the Trump administration really wanted to protect with some earlier tariffs. The goal was to bring back domestic steel production and create jobs.
And how's that working out so far?
Yeah. It's been kind of a mixed bag, honestly. We have seen domestic steel production go up some, but there have been some bumps in the road, too. The tariffs made steel more expensive for the companies that use it to make other things, so their products ended up costing more. And that's caused some pushback from industries like construction and manufacturing.
Ah, so it's that ripple effect again. Tariffs on steel to help the steel industry end up hurting other industries that need steel.
Exactly. It just goes to show how complicated it can be to mess with the market. It's hard to predict every outcome, and you often get these unintended consequences.
Starting to feel like we're dealing with a tangled-up mess here. These tariffs are pulling on different parts of the economy and causing all sorts of unexpected issues.
You know, that's actually a great way to put it. And to make things even more tangled, you have to consider the geopolitical side of all this. These tariffs aren't just about economics. They're about power dynamics on the global stage.
That's a good point. One of the research papers you shared talked about how these tariffs could make things worse between the U.S. and China. It even mentioned that China has already hit back with its own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Yeah, that's a big worry. If the two biggest economies in the world start a trade war, it could be really bad for everyone. Global growth could slow down, supply chains could get disrupted, and people could even lose confidence in the economy as a whole.
So we're in a pretty tricky situation. Is there any way to, untangle this mess? What are some potential ways this could play out?
It's tough to say for sure. Things are changing fast. One possibility is that the U.S. and the countries affected by these tariffs could sit down and negotiate, try to reach a trade agreement that works for everyone. They might have to compromise, each side giving a little to get a.
A kind of give-and-take situation where everyone benefits in the end.
Right. But another possibility is that the tariffs just stay in place, and then we end up with this long period of tension and uncertainty. And that could have some pretty serious long-term effects on global trade and investment.
So both options come with some risks. But no matter what happens, it seems like this whole situation really highlights how connected the global economy is and how important it is for countries to work together.
Couldn't agree more. We're all in this together, and what one country does can affect everyone else.
It's been a super insightful conversation so far. But before we move on, I want to think about our listeners for a second. We've talked about tariffs, trade wars, and economic uncertainty. So what can the average person do to navigate all this?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is to just stay informed, keep up with the news, and try to understand how these things could affect your own finances and investments.
What about people who are feeling anxious about their investments with all this market volatility? What would you tell them?
It's totally understandable to feel that way when things are shaky. But remember, investing is a long game. Don't panic and make impulsive decisions based on what's happening in the market right now.
So no knee-jerk reactions. But are there specific things people should be doing? Like, should they change their investments, hold on to their cash, or try different investment strategies?
That can be tricky. It really depends on your individual situation and how much risk you're comfortable with. But here are a couple of general principles to think about. Diversification is super important. Make sure your investments are spread out across different types of assets, sectors, and geographic areas. It helps to lower your risk.
So don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Another thing is to take a look at your investment goals and risk tolerance. If you're feeling really uneasy about all the market volatility, you might want to adjust your portfolio to be a bit safer. Maybe shift some of your investments to things that are less likely to fluctuate wildly, like bonds.
That makes sense. Now, what about people who are thinking about making new investments in this kind of environment? Any advice for them?
If you're thinking about investing, it's really important to do your homework and understand the potential risks and rewards. Now might be a good time to talk to a financial advisor who can give you personalized advice based on your situation.
I like that. Having a trusted expert to help navigate all this is super important. Now, before we move on, I wanted to touch on something we mentioned briefly earlier, the potential impact on consumer prices.
Yeah, that's a big worry for a lot of people. Like we talked about, Tariffs can make imported goods more expensive, which means you could end up paying more for everyday things.
So what can people do to lessen the impact?
Well, you can try to be a smarter shopper. Compare prices, look for sales, and think about alternative products that might not be affected by the tariffs.
So basically, be a more mindful consumer overall.
Exactly. Another thing you can do is focus on cutting down your expenses in general. Maybe cut back on non-essential spending. Try to get better deals on your bills, or find ways to boost your income.
Those are all really practical tips that people can use in their daily lives. We've talked about a lot today, from how the markets reacted to these tariffs to the potential long-term effects on the economy and global politics.
We sure have, and it's been a really interesting conversation.
Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the political reasons behind these tariffs. One of the articles you sent talked about the different views on this.
Right. It's important to remember that not everyone agrees on whether tariffs are a good idea. Some people argue that they're necessary to protect American jobs and industries from unfair competition from other countries. They think tariffs can help level the playing field and create a better environment for American businesses.
So it's kind of a protectionist approach.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But other people say that tariffs end up hurting the economy in the long run. They argue that they make things more expensive for consumers, hurt businesses that depend on imports, and lead to retaliation from other countries.
Sounds like the classic debate between protectionism and free trade.
Exactly, and there are valid points on both sides. Ultimately, deciding whether or not to use tariffs is a really complex issue with political, economic, and social implications.
It reminds us that these issues aren't always clear-cut. There are often multiple perspectives and trade-offs to consider.
I completely agree, and it shows how important it is to have informed discussions and thoughtful policies.
Well said. And I think that's a great point to lead us into our final part of this deep dive, where we'll wrap up with some final thoughts and key takeaways for our listeners. All right, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into, well, all the market chaos that followed President Trump's tariff announcement. You really dug up some interesting stuff for this deep dive, and I think we've covered a lot of ground already. As we wrap things up, I'd love to get your final thoughts from an expert's perspective on some of the key points that really jumped out from all this research.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really stood out to me was just how complicated this whole situation is. I mean, there are so many moving parts, so many factors that are all tied together, and it's really hard to say for sure what's going to happen.
It feels like every time we answer one question, two more pop-ups.
Exactly. It's what makes this so fascinating from an economic perspective, though. It's like we're watching this real-time experiment in the global economy play out.
An experiment with some pretty high stakes.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing that I found really interesting was the whole discussion about winners and losers. I mean, it's pretty clear that some industries and businesses will actually benefit from these tariffs, but others are definitely going to feel the pain.
It's like a seesaw, some going up, others going down.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And it's important to remember that these tariffs aren't going to affect everyone equally.
So while some people might see new jobs in certain industries that are protected, others might be hit with higher prices or even lose their jobs in industries that are hurt by these tariffs.
Right, exactly. And it's really important to think about those different impacts when we're trying to figure out the overall effect of these policies.
It's a good reminder that economic policy isn't just about numbers. It's about real people and how these decisions affect their lives.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my last point, which is that it's so important for everyone to stay informed and engaged in these discussions. Like we've seen, these tariffs have the potential to affect a lot of things, and it's complicated.
Yeah, it's not something you can just ignore.
Definitely not. It's really important to stay up to date, understand the different sides of the argument, and be part of conversations about potential solutions.
So for our listeners who have been with us through this whole deep dive, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this?
I think the most important thing is to understand that this is still a developing situation. There's a lot that could happen, both good and bad. To stay informed, be aware of the risks and the opportunities, and make smart decisions based on your own personal situation.
That's great advice. This has been a really insightful deep dive, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Always enjoy these kinds of conversations.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it informative and engaging. Until next time, stay curious.